Welcome to the first episode of the Lean and Agile Thinking for NGOs and Nonprofits interview series. I'm Steve Bell. During this series, we'll hear from thought leaders across the Lean and Agile communities, and we'll hear from people working with NGOs and nonprofit organizations around the world, sharing their experiences and lessons learned as they practice continuous improvement, innovation, and learning. We'll focus on how to do the right things, doing them the right way by asking the right questions to help us address the challenges and opportunities facing our future generations. Today, I'm pleased to welcome a pioneer of lean thinking, Dan Jones. Dan and his partner, Jim Womack, coined the term lean 27 years ago in 1996, and they launched a global movement that continues to evolve today. In the time since then, Dan has had the privilege of looking deep inside some of the largest enterprises on the planet, doing what he does best, observing, asking difficult questions, listening carefully, speaking softly and wisely. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Hi, Steve.
To frame my first question, I want to share a little context. Your first book, which you and Jim published in 1990 while you were at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as part of their International Motor Vehicle Program, responding to extreme competitive challenges from Japan. Your research revealed many secrets of Toyota's production system, which was the basis for its enduring success. Your ongoing work led to the best-selling book, Lean Thinking, which you published 6 years later. You didn't call this book Lean Tools or Lean Practice. You called it Lean Thinking. Why?
Well, because actually it is a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we work together. And it's not, as we discovered, initially we thought the tools were fascinating. We were followed using the tools and experimented, and gradually over time came to recognize that actually behind the tools was a fundamentally different way of thinking. And so that's why we called it lean thinking. And I don't regret doing that. I think that's exactly what it is.
So Dan, when someone asks me to define lean, I have difficulty, even though I've been doing this for decades, because there are so many different perspectives and different lenses to see it through. But at the root, it seems that many of the dysfunctions of organizations can be traced to what you like to call modern management systems and the pervasive mindset behind them. Can you help us understand how lean thinking can guide us to a better way of leading and managing organizations? And if anything occurs to you, particular aspects of management systems for NGO and nonprofit organizations that you feel are particularly important to highlight, although it may be they're organizations and people just like anyone else.
Well, I look at the NGO world as comprising very, very different circumstances. I mean, responding to an emergency crisis somewhere in the world is one. Uh, Deploying a vaccination program is another form of organization. And then you have all the guys out in the fields, guys and girls out in the field, desperately trying to solve the problems, the deep problems they've got out there with whatever support they can find. So I think it actually depends on exactly the work that is involved.
Yeah.
But I think the reason why lean has been is difficult to pin down is because everybody has come at lean from different perspectives, and they all bring their own perspectives to lean. And many of the consultants, of course, want to differentiate their understanding of lean and brand their understanding of lean in the marketplace. So it's got a lot confused. But I think we've been able to steer a course that is pretty much based on very detailed observation of what we see and what we hear in practice, and a dialogue with the Toyota senseis that constantly encourage us to look deeper and to challenge our understanding. And so actually we've learned from the source about the development and the practice of lean. And that has kept us pretty honest to a core definition of what lean is really about. I think that the other aspect of lean is that Toyota has been the model for that we've the reference point for all of our studies of lean. And the Toyota's had a tremendous run out of lean for 50 years, and we've been studying them for 30 years and writing about them for more than 30 years. And yet, I think it's probably true to say that Toyota is no longer the model company that everybody's looking towards, looking for, the Apples of this world, but also now the Teslas and the BYDs from China and so on. They're rightly attracting attention, and possibly saying, well, Toyota's old hat, and we don't need to follow that anymore. I think that's a big mistake, because Toyota actually has produced a business system based upon people, a people-centric business system, from which we still have an enormous amount to learn. And that doesn't rule out combining that with technology at all. And I don't actually worry about Toyota in the marketplace, because its ability to learn and to change and to respond to new circumstances is far better than most of the competitors. So I don't worry about Toyota surviving, but I do think that Toyota is no longer going to be the poster child. And so we're end of an era, and really it's time to look back on what we learned from studying Toyota over the last 30 years.
Well, clearly, Toyota has been behind the lean movement from the start, though you and Jim uncovered interesting historical precedents all the way back to the Venetian shipbuilding industry in the 1400s. And although many people associate lean with manufacturing, it's clearly spread to every sector of the economy and every domain of human endeavor. It's had tremendous influence on healthcare and other customer service-oriented industries, and enormous changes in logistics and financial services and so on. And we're starting to see some advantages in the humanitarian world. And the one thing all of these large-scale organizations share are their management systems, how people lead, how they manage, how they communicate, how they collaborate. Can you tie all that back into what a lean management system might look like?
Well, let's first of all be clear what the modern management system that we exposed.
Yes.
When our benchmarking works, and when we did the benchmarking study, we exposed the traditional form of management that was based on Alfred Sloan and Jack Welch later on. Really, our work grabbed attention when we demonstrated the enormous leap that Toyota made in performance, both in terms of productivity and quality and time and responsiveness. And that showed up the weaknesses of modern management, of the traditional management system we've all grown up to live with. And that management system was based on stable markets and stable industries and stable technologies over periods of time. And it was about organizing by functions, by departments, or by activities, organizing vertically, and making sure those were controlled through central budgets, the allocation of money through central budgets, and the asset utilization, basically. If you're busy, if your department's busy and you're using your budgets, that's the best we can hope for. And that meant that engineers went off and developed even faster and bigger machines. And departments became sub-optimized, or optimized was point optimized rather than system optimized. And you got the evolution of batch and queue systems. Basically, the products were made very quickly and moved to a queue for the next operation or the next department. So actually, as long as everything was busy, that was a sign of success. And that led to engineers going off to design even bigger machines to make even faster products. And that led to lots of fast products being made and to sit in the queue waiting for the next operation or the next step or the next plant or whatever. And that led to global spaghettis. And instead of taking a few hours to make a product, it actually takes often typically months and months, if not years. 2 years typically to make a pharmaceutical drug. a year and a half to make many engineered products like an automobile from when the first metal is cut. 120 days to make a fan blade for an aero engine, 5 different factories. This is really extraordinary how much point labor and point optimization leads to system waste.
Yeah.
And this global spaghetti, of course, is fine. It means that time doesn't matter, and we'll just focus on lower costs and point utilization of assets. And that builds a system full of waste and quality problems.
Yeah.
The Toyota system, on the other hand, was very different. It was searching for an alternative way to compete with the established players. So initially, it was also in a fairly stable market environment and stable technology environment, although later on, we'll see what happens. And their alternative path was organizing, instead of by assets and departments, by workflow, by the end-to-end, what we call value streams, the flows of work that actually create the value, and trying to synchronize those flows and build them back into a continuous flow, right from raw materials to end products. And that, of course, you can only do if it depends on the problem-solving capabilities of the people, of the teams running each piece of the system. You can't link them together if the system is constantly interrupted by different problems. And so the ability of teams to sort out the problems and build the capabilities to keep the system running are absolutely key to running an integrated system. And that's the key insight for Toyota's work. And it's not just the capabilities to do today's work and stabilize things so that you get right first time and so on. It's actually about continuous improvement as well. And that brings a dynamic into the organization because you're constantly not only solving problems, you're actually collecting experience and solving next level problems through experience. And so that collaboration then between teams allows you to flow products and quality and engineering drawings or whatever. And that gives you that led to the situation where you dramatic reduction in time, a dramatic reduction in effort, taking away most of the inventories in the pipeline, and co-located clusters with suppliers, dramatically faster ability to respond to changes in marketplace and so on. So that's on the production side, but the really significant thing about the Toyota system in a changing environment is actually Toyota's development system. And there they applied actually the same logic. How do we synchronize the development steps to go beyond the traditional waterfall project management system? How do we synchronize and overlap and synchronize all of the steps? And again, with using visual management and using a lot of the tools that the agile world has discovered, Scrum and Kanban and DevOps and so on. All of those are pieces of the puzzle about how you run a more integrated system for design and development as well. And coordinating that in a visual management room, in a war room, for instance, or a Rabea room as it's called, and reviewing progress very quickly, very frequently, allows you to pick up on any hiccups that are likely to delay everything later on. So the faster you can receive the problems, you can deploy resources and get back on track. That's how you synchronize design. Is that actually it's the context of the synchronization and what you're doing actually turns development from a project management process to a continuous development process. Because where you're developing not just today's model and the next generation model, you're designing a succession of models over time. And so actually the important thing there is also to capture the learning that is normally thrown away when a project is disassembled and a project team leaves, is capturing the learning and deploying that to the next set of problems. but coordinated by a chief engineer who has the responsibility for the choice of the direction that the next iteration of the product design will take. And that's, choosing not to change everything at once, but what the most important thing that we could change in the next iteration of product is. And over time, quickly iterating those products. So you get the scale-up effect, rapid scale-up, while you also get the system capabilities and the efficiencies of not introducing too much chaos in newly designed products. So Toyota's design system, I think, is less well understood, but actually much more important now for our age, when scale up of new ideas and exploration of alternative technical solutions is actually what's required.
Yeah.
So that's if you like it's a nutshell description of the contrast between traditional modern management and Toyota's system. Toyota's people development system. It's because the people in the system it's the capability of the people in the system to manage the day-to-day work and the improvements, and to collect the knowledge and to feed that back into next generation products.
And I think this is one area where we can tie directly to the challenges that NGOs are facing globally, especially the biggest ones facing the biggest challenges. And that's the question of autonomy. Let's say any of the large NGOs are focusing on one or several very big topics, and pick any of the 17 topics from the United Nations Development Goals. Hunger, poverty, women's rights, learning, children, health, you name it. They're big, they're very big. And they may have, this one NGO may have one or several topical areas like this that they're working on, but then how poverty manifests, or how agriculture, hunger, or women's rights issues manifest on different continents, or in different cultures, in different countries, or even different communities within those, means that these organizations have to be doing similar things, what you might call a value stream, but they're very different in these different teams, yet somehow these teams have to be autonomous to deal locally, but have to come back together at the global level so they can share lessons learned with each other. How does that translate to your notion?
Well, I think if you're going to have teams problem solving in different circumstances, in different places, with different problems, then you need a common language. So if you've understood that the importance of developing problem solving right across your organization is important, then you need a common problem solving language. And that's where Lean starts, basically, is what is the common language with which people in different teams in different places address the problems facing them in that circumstance, which is totally different to different circumstances. But the method, the logic behind the problem-solving process actually is the same. And if you can create a common language, a common way of describing a problem, of analyzing a problem, of understanding the root causes, of discovering how you would measure success in solving that problem, of finding alternative countermeasures to solving that problem, of carrying out the experiments to see what works and what doesn't, and then reflecting on that. That's a common process, and a common language you can, for any kind of problem, and it can actually be a small problem and it can be very big problems. You just need a slightly more elaborate problem-solving process. So a problem-solving process and the language in which you record the process of solving the problem is absolutely key. So people are able to compare problems and actually able to describe them to each other. That is context, across contexts, is very important. So a common problem-solving process is really the start. Now, you learn by problem solving, teams learn or individuals learn by problem solving, obviously need a coach or a mentor, somebody who's solved these problems before, has more experience in solving these problems, to mentor them through the problem-solving process. And the interesting thing at the end is that the mentor and the coach is less interested in the solution that you've come up with than in what you've learned through going through that process. Because it's what you've learned through going through that process in a structured, conscious way that will deepen your understanding of facing the next problem and the next problem and the next problem. And so capability is built through successive problem-solving cycles. If you use a common language and follow a common approach and can describe it and summarize it in a very well distilled way, and if you can capture it and share that later on, that becomes a basis for sharing similar problems in different circumstances that people can use as a starting point for solving a similar problem in their own area. So I've seen in an organization, one organization I worked in many years ago, we actually collected in a systematic way, using the same kind of approach, problems right across the world in all kinds of parts of their organization. And that became the starting point for teams trying to solve the next problem. Who else looked at similar things in different places? What did they use to solve those problems? How can we think about solving these problems? What are the tools that they used? Do they use Kanban? Do they use single piece flow? What are the other of the Toyota tools did they use? And how might those apply to our circumstance? So actually, it's a common problem-solving language with a mentoring process to deepen the capabilities to solve ever more complex problems becomes the language that you share experience, and it builds capabilities. That's the foundation. So if you've decided that, if you've understood the importance of problem solving, then you have to create a problem solving language. Perfect. And that basically gives people the experience of using the scientific method, which is what the problem solving process is, as their language for educating themselves, educating their teams, and sharing the knowledge.
Perfect.
So that's an extremely important building block.
Good, good. And that really stimulates my thinking. Let me see if I can't thread a question together from that I think is, again, very important to NGOs. Two necessary conditions for that to happen, where learning that happens at the front lines in one location gets translated across the organization, that percolates up. And I don't think we have the time to go into this in detail today, but the whole notion of visual management, making what we learn visible, and the collaborative, almost inspiration, respiration, I mean, where an organization breathes in and breathes out. It's learning as part of their daily, weekly, monthly management cycles. And Toyota had a name, Hoshin Conry, for this, but we're just talking about what Peter Senge called a learning organization. And I think that is something that I believe NGOs do especially well, some of them, because they're scientists, many of them, who are dealing on a global basis. But the challenge for me is that a lot of large organizations are very large, centralized, Doctors Without Borders, or Habitat for Humanity, or someone like that who has a global footprint. But by the time you get down to the front lines of the individual teams, maybe partnering with other NGOs, partnering with government, partnering with private industry and local communities and local activists and volunteers, by the time you get to the front lines where these problems are meeting reality every day, they have one thing. It's nice, they have good internet connections, a lot of them these days, but they can't buy books. They can't afford to hire coaches or mentors. But it seems to me that these NGO organizations should be able to extend some kind of framework of learning down to those front lines to enable the sort of thing you're talking about now. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's this common language of problem solving it can be in the common language of problem solving doesn't depend on the size of the problem. It can be big problems, little problems. It can be local problems. It can be big organizational problems. It's the language that And the approach and the thought process, which is where we come back to lean thinking, the thought process behind it is a scientific process. And that is what is shared. And that begins to build a connection. So on the one hand, you're wanting to create autonomous capabilities. The next step, of course, is actually to link those things together. So it's not just linking what's going on at the front line with what's going on at headquarters, although that's a very important. If you're talking the same language for a mega problem and for a micro problem, that already is a very, very powerful connectivity, a fractal nature. The other question then is, how do teams relate to each other? And you need some kind of standard interface, which is we've come across in the IT world, a standard interface that is unambiguous, if you like, about what teams require from each other, because that actually frames the problems for the teams that they're trying to meet the challenges from supplying and supporting other teams. So just as important as the problem-solving framework, it's a common language, which in a sense a Kanban is an example. It's a common language of the connectivity that you're trying to build between teams in the horizontal dimension, but also in the vertical dimension. The Hoshin-Kanri process is essentially a dialogue between the leaders who frame the direction of the problems, the mega level problems, and the teams that are challenged then to come up with proposals about things that they might do to meet those goals. And you have this dialogue. Hoshin is essentially a dialogue, vertical dialogue, that actually aligns the initiatives that come out of the problem solving with the objectives of the organization at the top. And the other aspect of leadership then is not only framing the objectives in a way that is clear for people proposing solutions, so that they can propose the solutions to them, but it also is a way of deepening the vertical learning, if you like, because the vertical learning is equally important too. And in a Toyota, you will find a chain of help. The leader's job is not only to articulate the vision, but is also actually to articulate and seed the capability development necessary to solve those problems. And so this chain of help actually becomes the way in which you support the learning process out of these problem-solving activities. Because this is all based on learning by problem solving at a mega level, the micro level, at a vertical level, at a horizontal level, at a cross-organizational level. Because if you're going to collaborate with other organizations, you also need a common program, a common way of approaching problem solving in your partner organizations, where you have a common language. That becomes so much easier. And you can communicate the thought process and align the thought process, which makes coming up with hypotheses, instead of jumping to solutions, instead of firefighting, which is the normal way people operate in complex, challenging organizations. It's getting away from firefighting to learning cumulatively how to solve different problems in different circumstances. And as you learn, you also become more of an ability to mentor others. So this isn't about hiring experts. And that's where the whole consulting issue becomes very key, because hiring experts to do it for you just will not build the capability we're talking about. So it has to be a do-it-yourself process, skilling people using a common language and a common approach that is developed right across the organization. And that's actually the core insight from Lean. And it applies to doing anything, whether it's working in a hospital to manage the patient flows, or whether it's designing new drugs and carrying out drug trials, or deploying vaccinations. I mean, in the COVID crisis, people were using Lean to not only make the vaccines, but also to deploy them and actually to deliver them at the front line. So it's whatever work is being done, it's done by teams interacting with other teams and across organizations. And that's actually, if you start there, you start building the capabilities. So the problem solving objective is not just the immediate solution that you come up with in the problem solving activity. It's the learning that comes through having gone through that cycle and reflected on it to develop the better hypotheses for the next set of problems that you find, and the ability to actually diagnose the root causes more accurately and deeply than in the past, and to collaborate with others on bigger level problems. So it's a thread runs right through people-centric organizations.
The moment you used the word fractal in your last description, I remember to this day reading Lean Thinking for the first time. I don't remember if it was chapter 11 or chapter 13. I could even point to the page where I saw that word, and it was like a bolt of lightning for me to realize what was really going on here. And to anyone who doesn't understand what a fractal is, they're self-replicating patterns. They scale infinitely, up, down, sideways. And to your notion of there being a standard language, there being a standard repeating pattern, which is what Hoshin Kanri is, what problem solving is. The question for me is, these patterns don't just appear automatically. When you have a large distributed organization like an NGO with a footprint in countless locations around the world and partnerships with other scientific organizations, you have to create those patterns deliberately. And some organizations try to create them from the top down. Some leadership or champion appears at the bottom up and they replicate that way. I know there's no one way this happens, but any insights on how to create the conditions for that to happen would be really useful.
I duck the question by saying you've got to start from bottom up and top down. You've got to plant the seeds that will inform the way leadership articulates its intentions and its support for learning and so on.
Okay.
So actually leaders need to go to the front line to support the development of the front line and to understand the front line issues so they can frame their requests, their instructions in a way that the front line understands. So as we talk in the Lean world about going to the Gemba.
Yes.
And so the experience of the Gemba, of situations that are site specific, of people struggling in specific places with specific and very different solutions or different problems. Leaders, that's how leaders develop gradually their capability to lead. It isn't only just sitting in the top issuing instructions, and it isn't only by saying, I'll get some consultants to teach Lean to the teams, and then we'll see what happens. That doesn't work either. So you have to think about, as a leader, you have to think about, how am I going to learn to use this language and then to teach this language? Because that's the key. You know, if you can actually teach this and go through teams, training teams, helping teams develop problem-solving capabilities themselves, you learn a tremendous amount yourself about mentoring. And so actually even leaders need a mentor to guide them in the problem-solving sequence that will give them the insights, the next set of insights that they need. And so a real mentor for a real leader is somebody who is wise and has done all of this before and seen all of the problems before, and can guide the leader on which bits of the Gemba to go and see and which kinds of problems they need to see next. to deepen their understanding of how they can then teach the next layer down, and so on and so forth. But it has to be from the understanding of the Gemba, of the real Gemba situation.
Okay.
And that's not in the developed NGO world. That's not a strange thing. I mean, people go to this is a natural thing, because you are so close to the real situation, and you cannot be very effective, without constantly refreshing their understanding of what's going on.
Do you think there's value in pursuing the who's the customer question? In the framework of NGOs, I sent you an example of what I have in mind, because I mean, on the one hand, everyone's the customer because everyone lives on the planet, and you've got regulators and governments and this and that. But I don't know if that's just a little too abstract a question to squeeze any value out of.
Well, I think in the NGO world, the purpose of an NGO is much clearer. It's not just about making money, which it is in the industrial world, or particularly in modern management world. And so the purpose of an NGO is to actually make a difference to the people who they're trying to serve, to help. And so I think coming customer backwards, which is difficult for a lot of big organizations, actually is a natural attribute of the NGO world. Because what's the purpose without being clear about what the customer impact is going to be? So I worry less about the NGO world worrying about who's the customer.
I'm just thinking of many of the NGOs that I've worked with, and they come in all stripes. You've got a Doctors Without Borders that's a massive logistics organization that, like you said, has to respond instantly, setting up field hospitals and supply lines where as first responders. You've got somebody like Habitat for Humanity who develops long-term community relationships and supply lines. But then you've got a lot of scientific organizations out there. One I'm very familiar with in France, CGIAR, which is a big Gates partner. It has these incredibly smart scientists in different places around the world partnering, trying to solve big issues about agriculture that are local to Africa or local to this area. And to them, the scientific method is the way of working. So you've got these different skill sets and these different value streams or delivery methods, if you will. And there's got to be a place for each of those organizations where you can plant the seeds, if you will, of what does lean mean here, and then work from there.
Well, where I've experienced that is in hospitals. It's the doctors, yes, they think they're the scientists and they think in scientific terms. And they think, we're the only scientists who need to think about problems. Just leave it to us and just give us what we need. Well, actually, when you sit down and talk about the work that needs to be done and the organization of the work that needs to be done and so on and so forth, actually everybody needs to think in that way. And it's the understanding of the engagement of everyone and not just the deferment to experts. That's the issue. Deferring to experts is important, no question. But actually only relying on experts negates the contribution that can be made by everybody else who's on the front line desperately trying to struggle with a process that is designed elsewhere. And we all have experienced working in a process that doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, and is constantly being interrupted by all kinds of unpredictable events. And we can firefight and respond to those, but it's just more chaos on top of chaos. So even for the most detailed questions about how you load a truck, and things like that, how you undo the packaging for needles or whatever, those things have to be done in a way that delivers right first time every time. And understands and deals with interruptions to make the system actually flow. And so, you know, in a hospital ward, you see exactly the same situation as you're talking about.
And to your point, any, and not just to pick on doctors, but to pick on any industry that relies on authoritarian or expert people, or even in certain cultures more than others, they have an
Mm-hmm.
authoritarian
Mm-hmm.
nature to them. But in any
Mm-hmm.
case, does it just boil down to those in authority in whatever situation they find themselves have to relax their grip, be a little more humble, invest more of their energy on the autonomy, push more of that down and out into the organization and become more supportive than more of someone telling them what to do.
Yes, telling people what to do rarely works.
Yeah,
Deploying Six Sigma programs across an organization doesn't, using experts doesn't work. I've done that many times and it's a complete
yeah,
failure. Um, but it's actually recognizing that even the humblest person in the team or in the organization has something to contribute, and given the tools and given the understanding that their contribution actually is as important as the most senior expert,
yes,
um, and mobilizing both sets of skills, not just the expert skills, is what gets you a system that actually can work, not only work today, but learn and adapt and grow and improve and scale up for tomorrow. One final thought. Um, we've been talking about the deployment, the experience of the scientific, using the scientific method in our work lives, and expanding that from the experts who use it anyhow to the people who are not experts necessarily, the humbler people in the organization or the people out in the field. And I'm sure that the more we do that and the more people experience using the scientific method and standard and problem solving in their work lives, the more they will also understand the implications of the scientific approach to climate change and how things are changing in the environment. In what one thing I think is really damaging to the global climate movement is the resistance and the dismissal of science by those who have no experience of it. And modern management absolutely gives people no experience of using this at all because they're not considered, they're disposable labor. They just are there to do the work and to be paid and not to think. If we got everybody to think, we're actually democratizing the experience of using the scientific method and building much greater consensus on the need to make the changes we know we will need to make. So I think that's the lasting contribution, if you like, of the Lean movement is actually to what I call democratizing the experience of problem solving.
well, and it would seem appropriate that if we're going to solve these problems that are facing us all, we're all on this together, we're all on this planet together. It's up to all of us to come together.
And every community is going to need to use these problem solving tools to build their own solutions. And
Yeah,
so this is actually pretty fundamental. This isn't just a management system. This is actually a way of thinking, and it's a way of helping broaden the experience of the kind of thinking we need that has gone into understanding the climate and what's happening to the climate,
yeah,
but actually needs to be very, very broadly experienced in solving it and addressing it and solving it.
indeed, indeed. Well, Dan, I'd like to bring this to a close. I'm reluctant to stop, but we need to wrap this up. And I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. You and I have been, we've had some amazing experiences together. And,
We have.
at the end of the day, it's not about leaving a monument or a legacy, but just, sharing our reflections and handing it off to the next generation because it's their
Yeah,
world. And I'm just
absolutely.
grateful for your time and your spirit.
Well, that's it's been a pleasure, and we've, as you say, we've learned a lot together through our interactions over the years, and I've very much valued your window into the IT world for me, and sharing that with you. I would not have learned or met all the agile leaders that I did through the conferences that we experienced together. So it's a two-way street. Don't worry about that.
Very good, my friend. This brings to mind another conversation I've been having over the last couple of weeks, looking at what are now called the unicorns, the internet companies that have exceeded $1 billion in revenue over the last few years in the last couple of waves of boom and bust cycles of the internet. And obviously Amazon, Netflix, Google, some of those companies come to mind, but I think there are several hundred internet unicorns. And these businesses, of course, you could say that even globalization to the scale that it's happened in the last few decades couldn't have happened on the backs of technology. But these new companies simply couldn't have existed. Nobody could have even conceived of them decades ago. And some people could make an argument that the people in these companies are becoming less and less important. And some will even say, projecting forward, either hopefully or fearfully, that the smarter AI gets, some people will be replaced altogether. But you can say that these companies, when they build their models around things that can be automatable, need fewer people to run them.
That's interesting, but all of the evidence doesn't actually point in that direction. Okay. And we come out of the COVID crisis, and workforces are depleted all over the place, not because they've been made redundant, but because for various reasons they've chosen not to carry on in the workplace, and in some cases they're sick. And so actually, despite the fact that the predictions were we would have surplus labor, the actual result is we got countries competing for labor.
Yes.
Because we don't have enough labor. And that points to the fact that however you automate, and I'm all in favor of automation of routine tasks, including writing tasks, actually you need people to run complex systems, particularly in changing circumstances. And so the lessons from people-centric systems is not to deny the possibility of technology, not at all. But it is true that Toyota developed a people-centric system before the technology existed to run a big integrated system from an electronic point of view. So it actually laid the foundations for the ability to run a complex system that then you could automate later on. And I think that our lessons from watching the deployment of SAP across the world, for instance, every time that somebody has done that after having leaned their processes and understood their process, they're more successful in introducing and getting the benefits of SAP.
Yes.
Whereas if they do SAP to automate old traditional management practices, all they get is a repeat of traditional management practices full of firefighting and expediting and chasing, and they don't get the benefits.
Yeah.
So, I think technology is going to be with us. We're going to have to learn how to use it, and we're going to have to learn how to live with it. But it's not going to get rid of people.
I couldn't agree with you more. Two phrases come to mind. I remember the old biblical passage, putting old wine in new skins. And I also remember years ago, Hammers and Champy saying we're just paving the cow paths. But in either case, you're right. The moment we automate waste, we make it, you might as well pour concrete over it. It's interesting, your point, though, that yes, Toyota started this journey before the era of business computers, which emerged later in the 1950s. And their Kanban for Toyota was pre-computers with little cards running factories. And nowadays, the agile world has adopted Kanban wholeheartedly to help people manage their workflow. And it works because it's the principle, it's not the mechanism of whether it's on a computer or a little card.
Exactly, yes. And I mean, interesting, the Amazon story, which we've discussed recently, is a very interesting case in point. What you've seen in most automation systems, like the SAP system and so on, that is an automation on the automating the traditional management practices of modern management.
Yes.
And they're actually, when they're now employed, they actually hold companies back. So I think much of the big system deployment at the moment is actually a real big negative. Whereas Amazon, I think, was pointing towards a very different logic to their computer systems, based upon on teams, on team competence,
Yes.
on teams interacting with each other through a standard interface, with a corporate objective basically of reducing time and increasing the speed with which they can respond to customer orders. That was constantly the objective.
Yes.
And I think those three principles are absolutely in tune with Lean, and now enabled them to scale up in a way that was really, really impressive, and points, I think, towards an IT system, an IT architecture in the future.
Yeah.
That is much more in tune with people-centric systems than the old automation systems of SAP and so on. So it's interesting.
It is, and you and I have talked in the past. I know you have a keen interest in Werner Vogels, who is the chief technology officer at Amazon, and seeing how their absolutely passionate, relentless focus on customer value, customer experience has led to incredible advances in automation, and led to, like you said, that one of the first real deployments decades ago of what's now common practice today, the whole technology architecture enabling that, has made Amazon, many people feel they're too good. They've done that too successfully. So what can you say to
on the other hand, Amazon, I think, is slowing down now. I've noticed that their order lead times for books, and I buy a lot of books on Amazon, are getting longer. And that's because Amazon over-automated their warehouses in the recession. They have too much warehouse capacity. So they're now trying to optimize the utilization of their warehouses. They're trying to optimize their truck utilization. And actually, instead of optimizing the flow, they're reverting to traditional management practices, and their customers' response is slowing down. And so I can also get the same book actually quicker from my local bookstore, who gets an overnight delivery from a book distributor. So I think Amazon's open to competition now, because they're reverting to traditional management methods in their IT systems.
Interesting. People say the same thing happened to Microsoft when they got too big decades ago. Maybe the same, maybe it's naturally entropy when a company gets too big.
Sure it is. Yeah, absolutely.
This reminds me, we're so far off track, our planned interview. I'm sure, well, I'll get us back there, but I just can't not follow this thread. I remember a joke that I heard years ago. I can't attribute it to anyone or what era it came, but it was the old joke back in the old days of science fiction, when we all had visions of artificial intelligence and what they used to call lights out factories, where the factory just run by itself. And the old joke was the only things you need to run lights out factory. You probably heard this. You needed a man and a dog. A man to make sure the lights stay out, and a dog to make sure the man doesn't touch the light switch. And beyond that, that's all you need. And the reason I tell that is obviously we had over ambitious notions of what automation could do. But to circle this back to NGOs, if you look at Bill Gates' book a couple of years ago, where he did a very scientifically informed look at climate change and the things that contribute to climate harm, and the things that need to be done to turn that around, he was very clear that the things we need to do, we do not know how to do today. And that we'll rely on technology to get us over the hump. But to do that, we need to rely on the people to innovate, to come up with the things that need to be done to get there. So there's an interesting symbiosis now between people and technology.
And that's exactly where Lean comes in, because actually Lean is about getting people together to work towards a common goal and to scale that up very fast.